grew up in Staffordshire on a farm, so beautiful farm where I just ran in the fields and played in the woods, and that was where I grew up. And it was idyllic in so many ways, just living with the animals. And then I met my husband Moth, and we bought a little house close to the farm where I grew up. And then we lived there for quite a while before we moved to Wales. We bought the farm as a ruin, so it hadn't been lived in for years. And so when the children were really tiny, sort of like 18 months, 2 years old, we started to renovate it, and we rebuilt the place stone by stone, slate by slate, converting the barns and the outbuildings to holiday lets. And we grew vegetables. We had a lot of vegetables and sheep. We used to keep sheep. And our children grew up there. They grew up feeding the lambs and digging the potatoes and climbing trees. And they spent their whole childhood there. So it was really their family home. And then we had people that would come to stay in the holiday cottages and share our life with us, really. So they'd get involved in what was going on the farm and become part of our lives, really, for the week before I went home. And it was idyllic life. It was the life we'd chosen. We'd had a long-running financial dispute with somebody who'd been a friend since my husband was a child. We always thought we'd be able to resolve that, but unexpectedly and unfortunately it ended up in court. The judge didn't feel the same way about it as we did, and the evidence that we found appeared too late, and we were served with an eviction notice, which was utterly devastating because that was our dream, to live where we did, to live the life in the way that we did. It had been our dream since we'd met when we were teenagers. So we'd spent our whole life working towards that and then living that idyll that we created. And we really had created it ourselves. So to lose it felt like we were losing our history, losing our whole life that we'd worked towards. It wasn't just a house, it was our whole life, really, to that point. So we were in the court, and the judge said that he was going to give us a week to leave our home. So that was a week to pack away 20 years of life, to close down everything that we'd worked towards and go and just leave. And that in itself felt like the worst thing that could possibly ever happen to me. It felt as if my life was falling apart. But then just days after that, so during that awful week of packing boxes, just days after the eviction notice was served on us, my husband had a hospital appointment. Now, we thought that was going to be just a routine appointment where he'd be told that the shoulder pain he'd got was just something that could be resolved with minor surgery. But it wasn't. He was actually diagnosed with corticobasal degeneration, CBD, which is a neurodegenerative disease. It has no treatment and no cure, and there was nothing that could be done by anyone. And in that moment, our whole lives just dissipated in front of us. Everything that we'd believed our future would hold was gone. The future turned into a void, really. It just felt as if there was nothing there for us and our lives really were over. We were in the house at the last moment when the bailiffs were knocking on the door. We were hiding under the stairs, actually, not pretending that we hadn't got to leave. We knew we'd got to leave, but we were just hanging on to that last moment in the house. We just didn't want to take that final step over the threshold, knowing that we'd never, ever be able to come back. So we were just hanging on to that last minute. And it was in that moment that in a packing case in front of me that hadn't been taken out of the house, I saw a book. It was a book that had been written, that I'd read decades before, written by somebody who'd walked the South West Coast path with his dog. It's called 500 Mile Walkers, and just in that moment, it seemed like the most obvious thing to do, to just fill a rucksack and go for a walk. And so that's what we did. We had to prepare to walk, which was unexpectedly easy because we bought a tent off eBay, a second-hand used tent from eBay, and 2 sleeping bags from the supermarket, and we were ready. So we put those in our rucksack and found our way to the South West Coast Path, which I think we didn't at that time quite understand how hard the South West Coast Path was going to be, because it was 630 miles across the whole of the coast of the southwest of England, across cliffs and beaches and moorlands, and that it had an ascent that was equivalent to climbing Everest nearly 4 times, which would have been difficult enough if we'd both been young and in perfect health. But I was 50, my husband was a little older, and he'd just been diagnosed with a terminal disease. He was struggling to put his coat on without help, and just to get the rucksack onto his back was hard work because I had to lift it up for him to put his arms through. So it wasn't possibly the most responsible thing that we could have chosen to do, but just the idea of following a line on a map just seemed like a reason to go forwards, a reason to go on, and we desperately needed that at that time. We desperately needed something that would take us forward and take us into something, some other part of life. When I began walking, I really thought that home was just the stone walls that surrounded me, and that because I lost that, I would never feel anything of that sense of what home was ever again. But as we walked across those incredible headlands, we were wild camping, so we were just pitching a tent every night wherever we felt was a safe place to put it. And in the process of doing that, there was something so magical about that wilderness that began to feel like home. It began to feel like a safe place. And that is what that time in nature became. It became my safe place. And eventually, by the time we got to the end of our walk, I'd come to realise that home really wasn't those stone walls. It was what made me feel safe, it's what made me feel secure. And for me, that was always going to be my family, whether they were spread across the country or right there on the path next to me, there in that wild natural environment that had become our home. Well, we were wild camping because we had virtually no money for food, never mind campsites. So we were just camping in fields and in hedgerows and on cliff tops. And that became the magical thing about what we were doing. That became so special to know that when you woke up in the morning, you wouldn't know if you were in a field of ladybirds hatching into their first flight, or if you'd be hearing seals call into each other in the coves below. And that was something so uplifting about that. It allowed, I think, a mental space, because we were walking between the ordinary everyday on one side and the endless horizon of the sea on the other. It allowed a mental space, I think, where we let go of all that anxiety and fear and concern about the future and just appreciated where we were. And something during that process, something about walking and just taking the next step and the next and being in that wild environment allowed my husband Moth's health to just improve in ways we've been told were utterly impossible. From starting his walk, not being able to put his coat on, he was carrying a rucksack and his feet were moving in unison in a way that they hadn't been able to before. And there was a surety in his physical abilities that he'd lost before that walk, and we'd been told would never ever return. So it became more than just a walk for us. It became something that saved us. It saved our lives, literally. Before we started walking, I hadn't really thought about homelessness because it wasn't something that had entered my life, so it wasn't something I'd considered really. Living in a rural environment, you don't tend to see many homeless people, so I hadn't encountered them. So as we passed people on the path and we had a conversation, and they would, seeing the big rucksacks, they would say, "How come you've got so much time to walk so far?" I would answer them quite honestly, it's because we've lost our house and we've got nowhere to go, so we're just walking. But the reaction from people became such a surprise to me that they actually physically recoiled, drew their dogs in on the retractable leads or gathered their children. It was a complete shock to me because I had never thought about the prejudices and the preconceptions that people carry about homelessness. I think that sort of came to a head when I was outside a shop on the north coast of Devon, counting a few coins that I had in my hand that by that time had become quite precious because we were down to a few pounds. And I didn't realise that there was a Labrador tied to a railing behind me. And as I was counting those coins, a lady with a big white dog came around the corner of the shop, the dog leapt at the Labrador, caught my rucksack, and all the coins flew on the floor. Well, they were like gold dust to us at the time. So I threw myself on the pavement with my hand down the drainage grill trying to catch the coins. And while I was lying there on the pavement, this lady started poking me with her foot and saying, "We don't have people like you here, don't have drunken tramps in the streets here, get up." And I was lying there and I thought, who's she talking to? Because it can't be me. Who could it be? But then it dawned on me that actually she was talking to me. And I think that was the point at which my self-esteem, that sense of who I was in my own life, never mind the wider world, the bigger society, I think that's when it started to really collapse. That sense of who I was dissipated in the wind, really. So then, after that, when people said, "How come you've got so much time to walk so far?" We would say, "Well, we've sold our house. We're just having a midlife moment, going where the wind blows." And then it would be, wow, inspirational. So the difference in our reactions based on preconceptions of what a homeless person is came as a real surprise to me. But as we were walking, we met so many people who were homeless and so many rural homeless that do keep themselves hidden away in areas where there are high house values and tourism is the main industry, where the local authorities like to keep the streets appropriate for the tourist. So they were hidden in woods and living in communities in horse boxes or under bridges. And it was amazing to find that there were so many people finding other ways to survive. And many of these weren't people who had any sort of substance abuse or mental health issue. There were people who were working in their local communities, but for numerous rural reasons couldn't afford to live where they worked. So it was a shock that it was a much bigger issue than I thought it could possibly be. I think that's the biggest problem that we have, is what to do about homelessness. It's very easy to say the answer is simply to provide accommodation. But I think it's far more basic than that. Because that accommodation can take months, it can take years to materialise for each individual. And I think that's the answer, is that we have to see that every single person that's homeless is an individual. They're not a statistic. They're not just a group of people. They're all individuals that have come to homelessness through their own path, through their own story, through their own problems. And we have to find a way to encourage people to see them as just people whose lives have taken a wrong turn. And if we can all view a homeless person in that way, then we are a million steps closer to actually solving that homeless problem, because then it's your family, it's your neighbour, it's the person next door. They are not a statistic or just a bundle of rags in a doorway. They're an individual person with their own story. We came to the end of our very, very long walk, and I think we were probably 2 days away from actually reaching the end point where we'd completed the whole 630 miles. And we stopped at a cafe to ask for some hot water. And we met a lady there and sat with her, and she asked what we were doing, and she wanted to know our story. So we told her that we were homeless, that we were walking, what we were doing. We told her the tales of where we'd been and the people we'd met. And unbelievably, she said, I've got an empty flat and it will be free as of tomorrow, would you like it? And that was like one of those moments in life that you think can never, ever going to happen to you. It was a moment of amazing disbelief that this person had trusted us enough to say, yes, you can move into my property. And that was like a dream. It was like a dream. Well, I thought going from the tent to the house would be the easiest thing in the world. I thought it would be the answer to everything. But actually it was harder than I thought, because we'd lived in that wild environment where I could open the tent flaps and hear the gulls and see the sea. And to go back inside felt so strange and confining. I found it a very difficult transition. And I think many people who've been homeless do. To go from that outside to inside life is really quite a difficult move to make. And we overcame it in a very sort of strange way, because for a few weeks we found we put the tent up in the bedroom and camped in the tent inside, which sort of solved the problem. When we were walking, I don't think there could have been anything further from my thoughts than the idea that I would write a book. We were just walking and just taking the next step and the next. And it didn't cross my mind at that point to actually write a book. But maybe 2 years after we'd finished walking, I started to realise how important that walk had been in my life, how it had changed my life and given me a strength that I thought I would never be able to regain. And that's when I started to write down the notes that were in the margins of the guidebook and turn them into a narrative and to write the book. And the process of writing the book was like being back on the path again. It was like being back there amongst the wildlife and the weather, and to be actually treading that path again. So it was a magical experience in itself to actually write that story down. I think what the path gave me was a sense of the importance of living for now, right now, in this moment, and to appreciate what is happening to you right this minute, not what's going to happen next week or what happened last week, but now, because now is really all we've got. And I think that's not just for me that the path has had that sort of effect, because I was walking on the coast path just about a year ago now, and I saw somebody walking towards me who was a backpacker. And as they got closer, I could see he wasn't your average backpacker. He'd got a face full of piercings and he was wearing a roadman's jacket and old-fashioned rucksack. So it was my turn to say, where are you going? Where are you heading from? And he was saying, oh, I've just been walking for 2 weeks now. I've come from the most southerly point on the coast path. But 2 weeks before that, I was living on the streets in Exeter, sleeping rough on the streets. But then I read an article in a big issue magazine about a woman who'd walked the South West Coast path while she was homeless. Well, I was so taken back by that, because that was my article. I didn't tell him because this was his moment. And I said, well, come back, have a cup of tea, have something to eat. And he said, no, I can't, because the path has given me a reason. It's given me a reason to go on, and I've just got to keep walking, because I won't be going back to my old life. And I think that's what the path, walking in that magical strip of wilderness, can do for me and anyone who really lets it in.